coordinator. I want to remind you that Flex Credit is available and that it will be posted starting Monday. So I will let the presenters introduce themselves, and I want to welcome you again.
I'll go first. Hi, everybody. I'm Wendy Bass. I'm the DE coordinator at LA Pierce College, and I'm going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions, throw them right into the chat and we will make sure we can address them.
Hey everyone, I'm Jessica Drawbond. I'm also a distance education coordinator at the district level. So I help coordinate the 9 colleges, and I will throw it to Dave Green.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dave Green. I'm the Interim Dean of Student Services for the Office of Educational Programs and Institutional Effectiveness at the district office. Formerly from Valley College, I see a number of my former colleagues from Valley. Nice to see you this morning, and good morning to my colleagues from Mission, which is where I'm currently stationed. So I want to thank you for coming to today's workshop. Just if I could get a thumbs up from anybody who has actually created or worked on an EEAAP already sometime in the last 2 years. All right. So what we're doing now in terms of EEAAP production is very, very different from the way that this started. And so I'm hopeful that you'll find this to be a much more streamlined and easy process. Before we really get into the nitty-gritty of what it's like now, I just want to say that this is an important thing for our district. This kind of comes around from having been in lawsuits for not having accessible course materials and not having and using software in coursework that wasn't accessible. And so the intention is really for us to be a little more prepared, or a lot more prepared, for students who may not be able to access some part of software that we might have. So we have this process which helps us identify where the accessibility shortfalls in certain software might be. Not all software is completely accessible, and what might be considered accessible may not be accessible to everyone. And so the EEAAP process is really to allow us to examine it ahead of time and create something of a plan so that if there's a student in one of your classes that can't access the software that you're using, we have a plan ready to go for them. Often it is something like they can't submit something through the software, so we would allow them to submit it external to the software, or perhaps it's a different project because the project in the software that's loaded into it can't be accessed. It's just a way for them to be able to perform the essential nature of the course that you have in an alternative manner because they can't access the software. And our district, we have obligations to access, but we also have, the desire to be accessible. To make sure that everybody can access the educational program is really important for everybody. So that's why we have this process. Jessica, do you want to add anything?
Sure, I would just say, from a faculty perspective, ideally every software, every publisher material would be fully accessible, right? They would be doing the right thing. They would be designing these products in a way that people using screen readers can access them, that every video is captioned, that, all these different users can access their tools in the same way as, a student without these issues, but that just doesn't happen to be the case. That's not what they're doing. So really this process is a way to allow faculty to use the products that you feel are going to meet the needs of your students and your course, but make a plan for the fact that these are not all fully accessible. For example, people using a screen reader might find barriers when they're using this product. So we have to have a plan in place because, by the time you find out, let's say day 1 or even a couple days before your class starts, that you have a student who is deaf or hard of hearing, you already don't have time to scramble and make sure everything's captioned, right? So that's why it's important to have these plans in place, that we've evaluated the products that we're using ahead of time to know what barriers exist and to make a plan for addressing them.
Excellent. Before I move further into it, I want to give a quick shout out to Wendy Bass, who's monitoring our chat. So she's going to be instrumental with that because when I start to talk, I don't really look at the chat. Wendy will cue me if there's anything I need to stop and talk about, or she'll answer questions herself if she's got the answer. So if you remember when this started, the process was a form. And that form was about 17 pages long. It included an awful lot of instructions and required you to do a lot of research on your own and become an accessibility specialist in order to figure out a lot of stuff, which even to this day, I may not know how to do. But you know the needs of your courses, you know the needs of your students, and that's why it's important for you to be involved in this process. We have scaled, well, actually before my time in EPI, it has been scaled back to now a 2-page form. So it's not a 17-page form, and it's really broken down into 3 parts. The first part is basically information about you, who's making the request, how do we contact you. The second part is about what is this software and what is it going to be used for, how many students. And the third part is, please give us the information about the vendor. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to just go over briefly what the form looks like now. I think if you're aware of what it looked like a year and a half ago, you'll be very pleased with how it looks now. Make sure I find the right form. All right, can everybody see my screen? Up at the top, it says Accessibility Review and Alternate Access Plan Request Form version 3.02. That just means that we're basically on version 3. I've made 2 edits to it since I started, but this is the form that you'll use. If you're using a form that says anything other than 3 point something, it's an antiquated form and you're not going to want to use it. You can get the form from me directly, or you can probably ask your DE coordinator. If they don't have it, they'll know where to find it, or they'll ask the right person on how to get it. And I think that we do have it posted in a directory right now, but I'm not certain how many people have access to that directory and whether or not that directory will remain public in the future. And we'll get to that a little later, maybe. In any event, as you can see, the first block is requester information. What's your name? What's your title? What's your department? What college are you from? How do we reach you by phone? How do we reach you by email? And date of request. Date of request is actually proving to be more important than we thought it would have been, because we're still finding requests that were sent to people who no longer work in the district. So it's good to have the timestamp on it on when you're actually sending it through. That stuff is super easy. The next part is, what is the product that you want? What are you using it for? So if you are an architecture instructor and you're using some specific software that helps you develop blueprints, then we would expect you to say just exactly that. How many people do you expect to use this in the course of a year? Well, if you're using it in 3 classes and nobody else in your department is using it, maybe you're talking about 100, 110 people. If your department's going to be using it and you're basically the first person who's making the request, but it's for other instructors, try to estimate the total number of students who may be using the software in a course of a year. Frequency and context. Is this something that they will access their homework on once a week? Is this something that you use in class every day? Try to give us the context of how they'll be using it and how often they'll be accessing it. Length of use, if you're planning on using this software in perpetuity or until the next version or a better product comes on, say you have plans to use this for at least this academic year, possibly longer if it works out. And this question is really the next one, comparison of products. As I said, not all products are created equally. Some products are more accessible than others. We want to know if you've looked to see if the product that you want exists under another brand, another type of product, something that does the same thing. So, because sometimes we find that we do a comparison and we find that there is other software out there that does what you want it to do. And some may be more accessible than others. I'll give you an example. Recently, I got a request for Westlaw, a program called Westlaw Edge, for a paralegal program. Westlaw is a software service that allows you to basically look up case law, cases that have been decided, and it gives you the information about that case, what the decision was, any stipulations about that case so that you can do research. But another company called LexCD has a product that essentially does the same thing, but in a different format. I can't speak to whether or not one is more accessible than the other, but if somebody were stating that they did a product search and this is the only product and it's Westlaw, we know that there are other products or versions of the product that other people make. We would want to see the VPAT or, well, and Jessica will talk about VPATs in a minute. We would want to know that you've done that due diligence of checking to see if there's another product that may meet your needs that might be more accessible than the one that you're looking at. And if the answer is no, or any answer, whatever you decide, why are you selecting this software? Why are you selecting it over other software that may do the same thing? That's probably the hardest part, this block right here, of this entire form. And it hopefully shouldn't be too hard, because you know your course, you know your subject matter, you know why you need the software. Please tell us. The last part of this form is the information about the vendor. Who makes this software, or where are you getting it from? What's the name and contact person for that vendor? Because I may have to call them somewhere down the line and ask if there are updates for something, for their VPAT, the voluntary product accessibility template. Specifically, what is the name and version of the software? Obviously, software gets updated from time to time, just like this form is version 3.02. Sometimes software will get updated, and we want to make sure that we're looking at the right version of this software. Product description. What does this software do? And do you have it already? Probably not. Is procurement required? And finally, are you planning to have this integrated into Canvas? That might indicate that we need to do some more checking on accessibility features and how we get it to be integrate with Canvas, and what those accessibility features are, or what students might need to do in order to make it more accessible with other types of assistive technology. That's the form. If you've done this before and you saw the 17-page form, I hope you find this a little more streamlined than that. But those are the three main areas of the information that we need in order to process this. That, and as you see at the bottom, we need you to submit from the company that's making the software, either their voluntary product accessibility template or their accessibility conformance report called an ACR. We cannot do any accessibility checking on this product, the product that you want, unless we have one of those two documents. And with that, I will turn it over to Jessica, who will talk about those two documents.
Is it okay if we pause for questions? There's some questions related to what you've been talking about.
Of course.
So one of them is Sasha's asking, is the form itself accessible?
The form itself should be accessible, yes.
Okay.
This form was created for this purpose. This form was created before my time with EPI, but I do believe that it was done at a time when they were checking for all forms, and we have that requirement. If we're posting the form on the web, or if we're sending it out electronically for its use, that form must be accessible.
Great, thank you. And then I think Jessica may be answering some of the other ones. People, I think, are asking where to get the form and how to get the form. And so I think, Jessica, are you going to show them where it is in LACCD faculty Canvas resources?
Sure, I can, but I did want to address the question, how often must a vendor update their VPAT? Do you know that answer, Dave? The answer is not as, they don't have too much.
So the district would like to see a VPAT that's been created within the last year. The last 12 months from the time that you are submitting the form. We're finding, or at least I'm finding, that that's not necessarily how often that a vendor will update their VPAT. So if the VPAT coming in is older than a year old, we would ask that you ask the vendor or the representative from the vendor when they plan to update their VPAT, and if their VPAT will cover WCAG 2.1 level AA, which I'm sure Jessica is going to talk about.
Rosa's asking though, what if a vendor does not have a VPAT? I have seen software approved for accessibility without it.
So the answer there is that we will probably put it in our file that we need to go back to the vendor in 6 months and ask again. Our district is really trying to reach a level of accessibility for our that covers website conformance for accessibility that covers a level called WCAG 2.1, which is one of the highest levels of accessibility conformance that is available in certain guidelines. We're shooting for that, and that's what we would like to see. We understand that not everything is built to WCAG 2.1 standards, but we're trying to monitor so that if the VPATs are revised, that we get a fresh copy when it's revised so that we can add it to our files showing the level of conformance. Jessica, you will talk a little bit about WCAG 2.1, right?
Yeah, we're getting more questions coming in though.
It's perfect. This is exactly what we wanted. So one of the questions is if we find an accessibility issue, how soon does the vendor have to update their software before the use of software is terminated? Great question, Kimberly.
There's no hard answer for that. There's nothing definitive. And that's why, again, we don't want to restrict our access to software that may help hundreds and hundreds or thousands of students, and 3 have difficulty accessing it. We want to make sure that those 3 have an ability to either access that or the level of the program that you're offering in an alternative way. That's why we're creating alternative access plans. But ideally, we would love to see every vendor conform their software to WCAG 2.1. We know that not every vendor does that. I have not heard a stipulation yet that we are going to terminate the use of software if it doesn't comply with any of the levels of accessibility conformance guidelines. Haven't heard it yet. I'm not expecting to hear it anytime soon, but I can't tell you what's going to happen in the future. All I can tell you is that right now, I haven't seen any plans to discontinue the use of anything specific because of that.
Dave, when you get a chance, can you put the document you were just sharing in the chat, the most updated accessibility request? Because I think even Wendy and I are finding we have a slightly outdated one.
I will, and not only that, I will also put together the instructions for that form that were also created.
Thank you. And then Kimberly's asking, are we opening ourselves to lawsuits by continuing to use the software? I'm assuming she means software with known accessibility issues. And I think the answer would be we are if you don't have an alternate access plan. I mean, the idea of the alternate access plan is that you can continue to use that software because there's a plan in place for students who come into barriers with that software. Is that right, Dave?
I think that's probably a fair assessment. Obviously, in our country, you can pretty much sue anybody for anything. So I can't tell you that there's a surefire method of making sure that we are bulletproof from lawsuits. What I can say is that this kind of falls on the line of what I used to call being out of compliance or actively discriminating against a student. Let me give you a deaf student example. If we have a deaf student who enrolls in a class and there are videos that are shown in that class, the law says that video has to be captioned. So if you're using videos and they're not captioned and you don't have any deaf students in your class, you're technically out of compliance. But the minute a deaf student enrolls and you have a video that's not captioned, now you're potentially actively discriminating the deaf student because the law says that videos need to be captioned. And so we're kind of walking that line here. If we don't have a plan in place by the time the student enrolls in your class, it may be too late to figure something out, or the student may fall behind while we're trying to figure it out, which is why we want to have the equally effective alternative access plan in place before students who may or may not, who may have an issue with being able to access things, before they fall into the trouble of not being able to access it, and then we don't have a way of giving them something alternative that will work for them.
Susan has had her hand up. Susan?
Hi, I wanted to address the Westlaw issue. So we already have LexisNexis, and they don't have the same content, and the paralegal department is interested in Edge, and that is what this, we really need both, and that is what the students would be using when they enter the workforce. So it's a critical software. It's a critical database, and it's replacing the older Westlaw product, which also I don't think that VPAT, when we processed that back when we had to fill out the mega long form, it also didn't address the 2.1 standards, but we were able to get it through, and it is critical. So it's just really stressful, and the contract is ending, and I don't know what. I'm just really concerned that the students won't have access to the databases that they need to do their work.
First of all, hello, Susan.
Hi.
I was only using the example that I know that there are differences between the programs, but they do kind of similar things. And so it was only for the purpose of illustrating the example that we want people to do their due diligence on looking to see if there's other software that might meet their needs. That being said, I'm happy to tell you that I received the EEAAP for Westlaw Edge last night. I will be sending it out for signature today. You don't have to worry.
Oh, thank God. Thank you. That's a big load off. Thank you.
Dave, Sandra had a really good question. She wants to know, what's the role of the campus DSPS office in the process of providing services to the students?
I think I have to ask for a little more context.
Okay, I'm sorry. So for example, you mentioned a student who may have some auditory differences, right? And so we send the student obviously to DSPS for all sorts of accommodations and assessments for accommodations. So I guess I'm just wondering, I know that a lot of this material is making course content accessible to students, but I'm just wondering, how is the DSPS offices rolled into this process so that they too have access to some of these software programs?
So it's unlikely that the DSPS office is going to have access to any of the programs that or most of the programs that you're using in your courses unless you give it to them. But realistically, they're not going to know your programs, especially if you're using specialized software for a specialized field. What the DSPS office is going to do is they're going to work with the students probably on training with assistive technology that they may have been using for years or may just be beginning to use. And some of that assistive technology may be interfacing with Canvas or with at some level with the programs that you're using. For instance, there's programs that will read things back to a student. There's programs that will enlarge things on a computer screen for a student. There's programs that will allow students to digitally dictate. You're seeing a lot more of that embedded in other software now, but there's specialized programs just for that. And so a student may be getting services from DSPS on learning that software or having access to the assistive technology. But in terms of instructional software, DSPS may not be able to provide a whole lot of help. Now, I'm going to pick on him. I happen to see that there's an instructional assistant from a DSPS office in this training right now. Adrian, do you want to add anything? Adrian Gonzalez from Mission College's DSPS office is here. If you can have about 60 seconds, if there's anything that you would like to add to that.
I think the main point is, what are we doing to support students with disability as an accommodation? So we work closely with faculty if there's concerns and trying to find solutions. But Dave is right. There are software that can be looked at as assistive technology if it does not interfere of your specialized software or in some way. This will be the support that DSPS can provide. That is why when you doing this EAPS document, it also is important to request a VPAT from the vendor. And so that helps in some way to see how much support the software can provide in this area.
Sandra, did that help?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Welcome, and thank you, Adrian, for chiming in.
Yeah, I did want to mention just there was a question in the chat from Adrian about they've looked at the accessibility review spreadsheet and it says it requires a new EAP. What should happen in that case? In that case, the requester, the faculty member should ask the vendor for the most updated VPAT, and I'll talk about what that is in a second, and then submit an accessibility review. Even if it's been approved in the past, if it says it needs a new EPAT, it needs to go through the process again. So they should submit a new accessibility review request. Yeah. And that would be the case for anything that says requires new EAP. If we're ready, I'll go into what a VPAT looks like. We ready for that? All right. I'm going to take that silence as a yes. All right. So here we are. I'm going to scroll up to the top. This is an example. I chose this example because Lapster is a tool that most people have at least heard of. Lapster is kind of a virtual lab tool that a lot of science classes used, especially during the pandemic. And I also think this is a good, clear VPAT that we can look at together, just as an example. I will preface this by saying I am not an expert in VPATs or accessibility. I've just learned a lot along the way, especially from Nicolas Cristoso when he was with our district. And hopefully that'll actually be an asset because I'll come to you from someone who, probably understands it at a base level. So it's not going to come at it from an expert's point of view and like over explain it. So VPAT it stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. And it's a type of accessibility conformance report. So it's basically a document that the vendor puts out in order to say, these are the accessibility barriers that do or do not exist with our product. A lot of times vendors hire an outside party to create these for them, but it is just a statement of, these are the known accessibility barriers with this product. I'm going to keep scrolling. So when it comes to your responsibility as a faculty member or as a requester of a product, it's really limited. Like Dave said, your role in this or what you have to do with the VPAT is really limited, but I still think it's important to know how to at least get an idea of what it means when you're considering whether or not to use a software. So when it comes to your responsibility, really what we're asking for you is to look at, first of all, you would request this from the vendor. A good starting place is even the rep you're working with. They can probably get it for you, or they can at least direct you in the right direction. Sometimes they'll direct you to the accessibility folks at the company. So you would ask for that voluntary product accessibility template. When you get it, a couple things, the most important things to start looking at are when it was last updated. And like Dave said, whether it covers WCAG 2.1, which we'll talk about in a second. So it'll usually be on the first page when it was last updated. So you can see in this case, I'm in edit mode. Let me stop being in edit mode. In the case of this Lapster VPAT, it was last updated October 20th, 2022, which is nice. That's recent. It's less than a year old, which is what we hope to see. If it happened to be more than a year old, then we would want to check with the vendor. The requester would want to ask the vendor, do you have a plan, or what is your plan date to release a new VPAT? Again, if it's over a year old. In this case, I wouldn't have to do that because it's less than a year old. The second thing that I'm really looking for, you can see it has some details about the product, a product description, who to contact for more information. And if I keep scrolling, what I'm looking for is this applicable standards guidelines area. I'm looking to see if it includes web content accessibility guidelines. That's WCAG, that's what that stands for, 2.1. So sometimes products, VPATs will only address WCAG or WCAG 2.0, and what we're looking for again is 2.1. In this case, it does. It's listed here under the applicable standards, so I know it addresses WCAG 2.1. The other thing we're looking for when we're looking at it, for our purposes, we look at level A and we look at double A. So in this case, we have WCAG 2.1, and we can say level A says yes, level double A says yes. So we know it's addressing everything that we want this VPAT to address. They're not always this nice, they're not always this clear, but this one happens to be. This one's even color coded, where it has it color coded, these different terms. So the next thing, and so again, kind of your requirements in terms of what you're asked to look at as a faculty member are those two things. How recent is it? Does it address WCAG 2.1? But like I said, I still think it's important, just from like kind of a responsibility level, to take a look at how accessible the product is and how many barriers there are. So when you want to go into that, you can look at these terms. So the terms will tell you just the specific terms that this specific VPAT is going to use in terms of looking through all these different areas, all these different elements of the product, and whether or not they're accessible. So it'll say either supports, partially supports, does not support, not applicable, or not evaluated in this case. Sometimes you'll see VPATs that say, instead of partially supports, it'll say something like supports with exceptions. But in this case, for this VPAT and this vendor, they're using the term partially supports. So if it says supports, that means they've tested this area and there are no known accessibility barriers. If it says partially supports, they're letting you know there are some functionality that is not fully accessible. Does not support means the majority of this aspect of the tool is inaccessible. Not applicable means it's not applicable to their product, and then not evaluated obviously means they didn't evaluate it. I'm going to scroll down to look at table A and table double A. So those again are the ones that we're really looking at for our purposes. It's going to be long, like this is multiple pages long, so I'm not going to get super granular just for the sake of time, but each of these is basically just like a different category, and it's rated in terms of all these categories. So you can see supports, and then we get to one that says partially supports. And in a case where it's partially supports or does not support, there will be a short explanation here in the VPAT. And these vary. I've seen some really good ones. I've seen some really bad ones, or they're really talking around it and not actually explaining. This one does a pretty good job of explaining actually what the problem is. So for example, for this one, it's saying in the area of info and relationships, it only partially supports, and that is because heading info is not given to all interactive parts of the accessible simulations. And then they say, we are working on implementing it in the future. So basically, if there's not heading info for all of the interactive parts of the accessible simulations, that's an issue for people using screen readers. That heading info is necessary for people using screen readers to understand kind of the hierarchy or the design, the layout of the page. And I'm not going to get into every one, but it's a good idea to look through and see. We're getting through it now to quite a few partially supports, right? Partially supports. Each one of these represents a potential accessibility barrier for a student. For example, in this area of pause, stop, hide, some areas of the simulations do not contain animated content. Some areas have background, non-essential animations that do not stop and cannot be paused. Again, this is another accessibility barrier. I'm going to keep scrolling just so you can get a feel for, largely supports, but there are still some partially supports. There are some not supports coming up. So this is the level double A table that we also need to look at. Overall, good. We got a lot of greens, but here's another partially supports. Here's a does not support, and this is in the area of images of text. The application provides a custom built-in screen reader or self-voicing features to read all text in the simulations. The text is not available to third-party assistive technology due to the nature of Labster's virtual experience, as is a visual experience of a laboratory which is sophisticated beyond the text-based websites WCAG 2.0 was originally intended for. So this is a pretty major accessibility barrier that would need to be addressed in that alternate access plan. There are certain parts of Labster that are not going to be accessible for people using screen readers, and that's a big barrier, and that's something that needs to be planned for. I'll just keep scrolling so you can see additional information and other partially supports. You can see it's quite a lot, but they do have many supports and not applicable, and that's where you ended, is that our review at this point for what we're doing for our purposes ends after you've looked at that double A table. I'm gonna pause to see if there are any questions about all that. I see the chats lighting up. Wendy, were there any questions?
Sorry, I was just putting in the, so that people could self-enroll in the
Oh,
LACCD
perfect, thanks.
Canvas resources. So I think that some of the questions will be answered because people are, oh, sorry, I didn't realize my camera wasn't on. So people will know where to go, especially if there's an updated one, even if your DE coordinator doesn't necessarily have it. Jessica, we make sure this shell is up to date. So everything in this one LACCD faculty campus resources is where everything will be that's kept up to date. So what I put is the self-enroll link in there. For people that are newly getting trained, we're automatically adding them to that shell now. But any of you that have been with the district for a while may not have joined the shell, and all of the resources are there as well as the list. So Jessica's going to go over that with you now and where you can find it.
Yeah, I just wanted to pause and make sure. I know we have some accessibility experts on this Zoom. So if anyone has any additions or corrections for anything I just said about VPATs, please let me know. But in general, yes, you just reach out to your vendor. They will either, your vendor rep, whoever's you're working with to get the information about the tool, will either put you with the right person or get that VPAT to you. Every now and then it will be called just accessibility conformance report rather than a VPAT. But the vast majority of the ones I've seen are actually VPATs. All right, there are no other questions. I'm going to, oh, Sasha, yes, please.
Yes, so I just wanted to add, if you can give an example for, let's say, non-conforming criterion, how can instructor then in best way accommodate student for the particular portion, in this case, Labster, to actively participate in course and get full access to the material that they do? I think that will be really like functional and applicable, a way for faculty to understand how can they do that.
Yeah, and I'll defer to Dave. You can add anything you'd like, but right now the way our process works is that we send this to a vendor and they create the alternate access plan, and then that is given back to the faculty member. So it used to be incumbent on the faculty member to figure out the workaround or figure out how to plan to accommodate a student who can't access the tool for these barriers because of these barriers, but no longer the case. I think faculty felt like maybe they weren't prepared to or qualified to do that. So as it is now, we will draft the vendor will draft the alternate access plan, send it back to the faculty member, and then they will sign and we'll get all the district signatures, and that's how it's sort of official. Anything you want to add to that, Dave?
I really don't. That was about as good of a response as I could have made. So
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
But I think something that a faculty member can do is, make sure that you're really looking at the alternate access plan carefully and implementing what it's telling you to. Oftentimes that means a syllabus statement where you're kind of giving a heads up to students. If you use assistive technology, this you may find barriers with this, and I have alternate assignments. Be prepared. If the alternate access plan says you need alternate assignments, then you need alternate assignments that students can create outside of, for this example, Labster. If you're adopting a tool that has already been approved, make sure you're following the EEAAP. Make sure you're reading the alternate access plan and following it and applying it to your class. Because at this point, we do have a lot of tools that have already been approved. We have a long list, and I'll show how to get to that now. I'll shut up and share screen. So I'm going to show the LACCD Canvas resource shell, the faculty Canvas resource shell. So here we are. Good plug for that if you haven't joined that shell now, although a lot of people have been added at this point. If you're looking for the accessibility resources, we'll keep scrolling.
Oh, will you go to the homepage?
Sure. Yeah, that's true. You can get there multiple ways.
Only because I think so. Let's point out that every campus has IT support and Canvas support that you can link to. And then if you scroll down, where we're working from is keep going down. It's integrations and LTI. So that's where all of the resources are. You can get to it by going to modules as well, but if you want to just be able to jump right into it, that's where you go.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, so click on LTI's integrations if you want to go right there, but otherwise you can scroll down. And these are all hidden for now. Let me go into student view so you can see it as you will actually see it. All right, so I'm going to scroll down. Sorry, pardon my fast scrolling to accessibility reviews. So you'll see there's the approved integration list. And that is where you will find that spreadsheet that states what has already been reviewed, what the status of it is. And this is where, for example, let's say I want to use Alexander Street. I can click here, I can open up the EEAP and make sure that I understand what my responsibility is. If there's a syllabus statement I need to include, if there's some kind of other workarounds that I need to be prepared to use because I've agreed to use Alexander Street. I'm going to go back to our show. So that's how you get to that list. I'm going to go back to actually, I'll just go back to the module itself, so we can get an overview of all the items in that module. Again, please excuse the scrolling. So then we have some common accessibility reviews that are used commonly across the district and the syllabus statements. I can click on that in a second, but we also have the process. So this is just kind of a Canvas page that explains what to do. It explains the same thing that we've gone over today, that you complete the form, you request the VPAT, you submit it to Dave Green, and then the district will review it, send it back to you for signatures. And I'm going to go to the next page so you can see this is where we keep the forms, the most updated forms. So we have the form that Dave Green was sharing earlier, and then the directions for how to complete it. I believe that's the last thing in this module, yeah. And then real quick, I'll go to that other page I skipped over. Oh, sorry, I'll go back. It's the previous one. So this is just an example of the most commonly used or widely used across the district tools, along with their VPAT, if it is available, their equally effective alternate access plan, the accessibility barrier or barriers, the responsibility of the instructor using the tool, and the syllabus statement. I will be honest, as the number of tools has gotten kind of, now we're at dozens, if not maybe over 100. We haven't kept up with every single one, but this has a lot of the ones that are most widely used across the district. Still a good idea to always check that whole spreadsheet to make sure if the tool you are wanting to use has already been approved.
Can you do me a favor, Jessica? Can you go back to the main menu, the home page again? And I just want to show everyone, there's also an area there that's on accessibility to kind of help make sure your content and anything you're using it's accessibility in Canvas, perfect. And there we actually even have like best practices and like examples for everyone. So this is just since we have you here and we're talking about accessibility, we can go through with you how to kind of make sure that your content that you're using is accessible.
Good idea, thank you. We have a hand up.
Yeah, Adrian?
Yes, I just want to also point out, if I may, as we are looking into the VPAT, and we have product that we're paying, a lot of dollars to educate our students, but also I want to be sure that if there is a product that is free, do we need to go through this process as well? And that's what I want to point out. It involves whether it's free or, you want to do this as a pilot, you want to do this, for your students. We have to go through this process as, what we're doing right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good question, Adrian. And the answer is yes, you still need to go through this process. Free might make it financially accessible, but it doesn't necessarily make it accessible. And we still need, if we're using it, we still need to make sure that our students, can either use it or there's an alternative to them using it.
Any other questions or comments?
I actually, sorry, I do have a question. So it is correct to say that only student or software tools are going to be used for students needs to go through accessibility. For example, I don't know, we use some software for our department to control or to monitor some of our computers. This is not something our students are ever going to use. Does that need to be also going through accessibility review?
As of right now, yes. I understand, the software that you're describing, that, it can lock down computers in a lab. It can monitor whether or not a student is going off of whatever your assignment is and onto the web to find other resources. And that while a student may never access that, or at least not now, we still have a need to make sure that software is accessible to employees. And while it might not be in your department where there's somebody who might need something else or something different or something to help them access it, we still have the need to make sure that the software that we're procuring is, we have the accessibility information and potentially an alternative access plan. And also there might be a situation down the line where we have student workers who might be working in a department and they might need an alternative way of accessing things. So we do still have that requirement for software, even if it's not student engaging or designed to be by your department, by your course.
There's a really good question from Dorothy about the free OER books. Do they need to have their place on the list?
Mhm.
Yes, I've actually gone through the process with a couple of different colleges already on OER resources, and we still do EEAPs for them.
Any other questions or anything else we can go over?
Yes, actually, I do have another question. I'm sorry to be such a pain. Our department is probably one of the departments that uses the biggest amount of software in the whole, LACCD. So we really have gone through a lot of painful moments with this. So one of the biggest problems was when the person in charge left or not communicated. All our EAPs were in, limbo. Because our funds came from a grant and the grant had a deadline. We missed the deadline to purchase the software. We lost about $20,000 and we had to cancel a class in the middle of it because we couldn't renew it. It was a disaster. And all of that happened because, again, just really serious lack of communication. Then it took us another month to figure out who was in charge. And now I just learned that Dave is in charge. So that was a big surprise as well. So any idea on how you guys can communicate any changes back to us in a way in which it's a lot more efficient, or because literally from the time we submit a review to the time we learn whether the software had been process approved or not, it took a good 6 to 8 months. And as you guys can understand, that it's just really not feasible for us. Again, to the nature of the grants, having a deadline, blah, blah, blah.
That's a Dave question.
Well, let me start by saying I certainly understand your frustration. Sometimes I've experienced situations in which the communication flow doesn't really get as far as it needs to. I typically see announcements like that go to VPs, like all VPs or VPs of admin or VPs of student services, and it doesn't necessarily trickle down. So that is something that we'll be discussing in EPI, how we can actually push information when there's a change, whenever the next person in line who gets this, when it's not me anymore, how we can get that out to faculty. My guess is that we can post it in certain places, like on the resource pages that have already been demonstrated in this workshop, but also trying to make sure that faculty are aware that there is a change for such a vital process and that it needs to go to other people. The good news is that I'm not planning to retire for at least another 9 years. So, but whether or not that means I'll be doing this, my email will still be active, or should still be active, hopefully through that time. So even if I'm not doing it, I will know who the next person is. And if you send me something, I'll be able to forward it on. But you're absolutely right. We need to be better just in general about communicating and pushing out information about who's here, who's not here, who's doing what, if those things changes. And I will discuss that in my staff meeting to make sure that the next time there's a change, that we actually make sure that it gets publicized well.
Yeah, I'll also volunteer myself. I don't plan on going anywhere anytime soon. And usually, a lot of times the issue is like the people who are in the know are trying to get people to get everyone in the know, and we're kind of hitting a brick wall, to be honest. So I will say, if you can always email me and ask me what's going on with the process, and I'll answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. We have another Dave question. So for an OER book, this is from Cynthia, wouldn't the EAP reviews be done for the platform they're accessed on rather than for each individual OER title?
Honestly, it's going to depend. I had 2 books come in from the same platform that had different levels of accessibility. That was about a month ago. So they needed separate EAPs. So I'm going to say that we're going to want to see it, you know, the request and the VPAT for each one, because if they're different, then they might require different levels of alternative access plans.
Got it. Thank you. And then someone was asking, which maybe we can have like some kind of calendared event. So like, when do you want like for someone that knows they want to use a product in the summer, when does the EAP need to be submitted by? For someone that knows they want to use it for the fall, when does it need to be submitted in time? So almost having like calendar events so people know that it needs to be, you know, the timeline.
Do you have a general sense of the turnaround now, Dave?
Most of the time, from the time that they get to me, I turn them around. You know, if they're not turned around to our vendor within 2 days, it's a very rare instance. And depending on which vendor they go to, because we have 2 vendors that are helping us with this right now. One vendor is faster than the other one is just sort of coming online. You know, it's usually back within a week, unless they flag it for certain questions where we need to do more research into the product. It's usually, if you don't have it back in 2 weeks, call or email me, so I can follow up on it. But it's these days, if it's not turned around in 2 weeks, and that's usually in the extreme, you know, it would surprise me. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't things that were in the pipeline before I started doing this that haven't shaken out of the pipeline and gotten to me yet. So I've been working on an ELAC this week that submitted things. The first one was dated January 3rd, 2022. So that request went in a year ago plus, and it hit my desk this week. So the good news is that those EAPs came back last night, and I'll be sending them out for signature. So the process does work fairly quickly. But if there's still things that are in the pipeline that got sent to Nicholas's email or Brittany's email and we haven't found it, I can't vouch for those until they get to me.
Great. Thanks, Dave. So there's a list now. So where will the recording be available? Jessica's going to send it out to anybody who was registered through VRC, and then we will also house it in that same shell, LACCD Faculty Canvas Resources. One of the folders is like faculty, like webinars and stuff. So you can go in and you can see any past webinars. Kimberly asked if the faculty or procurement's job is to submit the forms for review and approval. It's usually falls on the faculty for this in terms of, because it's your content that you know how you're using your content. There is a list of approved EAPs that Jessica showed everybody. That's also in the shell. And are there vendors who don't respond to our requests? Dave, have you had vendors not respond?
So let's draw the distinction between the different types of vendors. When I say that we have a vendor who's working on our accessibility reviews, those people respond because they're getting paid. And if they don't do it, if they sit on it, they're not getting paid. The vendors who are producing software, when we request additional, an updated VPAT, sometimes they don't respond. or sometimes it takes a while to get an answer from them. But I have not had any delays from one of our vendors because they're simply sitting on stuff or that they didn't notice that they came in.
Yeah, I would add, the time when it was taking months, that was when it was a different process. And I can concur with Dave that now it's been really fast. I'm trying to look.
So Kimberly, you're asking, we should create a list of contacts of different companies' accessibility teams. That doesn't hurt, any more resources for everybody would be great. Oh, sorry, I might have missed that, Marion. So Marion is double checking. So if she is interested in adopting an Illumin book, she needs to look and see if there's already a VPAT available for that book. And if there isn't, then she would submit it specifically for the book she wants to use. Is that correct? Is that the process?
Yeah, that should work as well as anything. Realistically, if there's already an EEAP for it, we probably have a VPAT for it. But the question is how old is the VPAT? If you're adopting a Lumen book, it never hurts for you to ask for the VPAT, because you may help us down the road if we're saying that we need to pull a VPAT for something 6 months from now because it's not current, and 2 months from now you get a more current VPAT than we have and we haven't asked. We'll just take that and we'll upload that to our system and then take the stipulation that we need a VPAT off. So that's certainly going to be helpful in the long run for all of us.
Got a couple more minutes. Any more questions popped up? Thanks, Rosa. When the faculty wants to check a software for use, who should they submit it to within their department? Can you clarify, Kimberly?
So I had different people submitting. So I'm in procurement tech.
Oh,
So
okay.
I had different people submitting softwares to me like, hey, we want to pay for this, we want to pay for that. And then there was no VPAT connected yet. Like there was no documentation. It was just like the purchase request form or the contract request form. And so then I'm like, okay, you just need to like do these documents, and then it would be a month. And then they're like, okay, but who's supposed to fill these documents? And then it's like, well, if you're doing the request, then it's your department that needs to fill out the documents. And then it becomes an issue between like the faculty member and the department chair and then the department dean. And so that's why like, is there a clear like line of instruction of this faculty member wants this software, they should contact this supervisor, this dean, and then they will forward it to procurement with the VPAT and everything like that.
My understanding would be the requester. It's upon the requester to seek the VPAT, submit the accessibility review request before they even, try to go through the procurement process. Ideally, I'm sure that doesn't always happen, Kimberly, but I would say it's always the requester's responsibility to at least initiate the process. Would you agree, Dave and Wendy?
I would certainly agree, but I also want to point something out, because I see them all as they're coming in. So I see who's submitting them and what their titles are. And I've had a few come in because they've been assigned to the instructional assistant for the department. And I usually will call back the department chair on that, because at the end of the day, I don't think it's great that a classified instructional assistant is signing off and requesting things and making commitments for faculty who are teaching. And so for my money, I want it to go through the faculty of the department, because I want somebody who knows what they're getting into when the EEAAP comes back.
Anything else before we wrap up? Yeah, I'll add this recording to both the webinar area of that shell and also the accessibility review module. And I'll also send it out to you all. It goes out to signature. Dave the requester signs first. Dave, are you the second?
Actually, I don't sign it at all.
Oh,
So
that's right. Requester, Vice
Request-
Chancellor.
the district ADA compliance officer is next, followed by the vice chancellor of educational programs and institutional effectiveness, followed by the vice chancellor of information technology. Sometimes those change. I can't say that that's not going to change anytime soon, but that is how it is right now. And usually what happens is that it comes back to me from the vendor, and then I create a PDF and then of the document, and I send it out to specifically everybody who needs to sign it at that point. And once it's signed, I then send an email back to the requester and say, okay, this has been signed. You now have access to it. The alternative access plan begins on page whatever, and please make sure that you or anybody else who is going to be using the software in your department follows the alternative access plan if needed.
Yeah, to Kimberly, to your question, this is just for the accessibility review, the EEAAP. That does, the only like campus level person who signs is the requester, and then the rest are district level signatures.
One of the things that I've floated out that's currently being discussed is that I believe it would be helpful to have the vice president of the requesters division also be on the signature, so that there is a college specific administrator who is aware of it. I recognize that all procurement items are signed off by the VP of admin from your college, but if you're basically an instructor, your academic affairs VP should know that this exists. But that hasn't been implemented yet. And if it does, it'll be fairly seamless. It'll just be another signature that goes on the form that I will have to route for signature.
All right.
Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate the effort you're putting into making sure all of your content is accessible for all of our students. And to emphasize, I think what Sasha had written earlier is that it benefits actually all our students, not just students that are that have been identified at our local academic accommodations areas. It really, even students that have English as a second language, I mean, I oftentimes, if I'm watching like an English movie, I always have the subtitles up because I can't, it's easier for me to read it than trying to figure out your accent. So all these things, it really helps all of our students. So we really appreciate the time and effort you all are putting into making sure that your students are having the best experience possible.
Absolutely. I want to echo that, and I want to thank you all for attending, but I also want to say, please help us by spreading the word. Let your faculty colleagues know that the process is different, that it's not what it was a year and a half ago, and it is not as painful as it was a year and a half ago.
Yeah, the ADA person that signs off on the EEAPs is the district level ADA compliance officer, Edward. All right, thank you all. I'm going to end it. See ya.